The Carolina sun was a merciless overseer, pouring down heat that cracked the earth and burned the skin. On the sprawling tobacco plantation of Colonel Jonathan Harrow, cruelty was not a punishment. It was the law. And among the hundreds of enslaved men, women, and children who bent their backs beneath that sun, there was one boy whose suffering was unlike the others. His name was Malachi, no older than 14, small for his age, but with eyes that carried both fear and fire. Malachi had been born into chains. His earliest memories were of crying for a mother he barely remembered, taken from him when he was 5 and sold to another plantation. He had no father, no siblings to cling to, only the cold comfort of the slave quarters, where whispers of rebellion mixed with the groans of the broken. Yet even in such darkness, Malachi's spirit refused to be crushed. He asked questions the others dared not. Why must we bow? Why must we suffer? For that, he was hated by the overseers. Colonel Harrow, a man of iron will and sadistic pleasures, despised any spark of defiance among his slaves. His fortune came not only from the crops they grew, but from the spectacle of their pain. Whippings were not hidden. They were performances. Shackles were not tools of order. They were instruments of theater. Harrow took pride in inventing new methods to make an example of those who dared resist. And so when Malachi was caught stealing a heel of cornbread from the kitchen one evening, a crumb of survival in a world of starvation, the punishment was far beyond the crime. That night they dragged him to the torture shed, a small wooden structure apart from the fields, its walls stained with rust and blood. The slaves called it the Devil's House. Inside hung chains, whips, and iron devices whose purposes none dared speak aloud. At the center of it all rested a contraption that struck terror into every heart: the Iron Mask. It was a grotesque helmet forged from blackened steel, heavy and suffocating, with no mouth opening and only narrow slits for the eyes. Once locked onto a slave's head, it cut them off from breath, food, and voice. Sweat poured, jaws ached, skin blistered beneath the burning metal. Days could pass before the mask was removed. Some never lived to see it unlocked. Malachi had heard the stories. He had seen the marks on men's faces. And now, as the overseers bound his arms and forced him to his knees, he realized the stories were not tales. They were warnings. Colonel Harrow stood in the doorway, his fine boots polished, his eyes gleaming with cruelty. "Defiance begins small," he drawled. "A piece of bread." A question whispered in the dark. "But a spark can start a fire, and I will not have a fire in my fields." The overseers forced the mask onto Malachi's head. At once, the world shrank into darkness and heat. The metal pressed against his jaw, his cheeks, his skull. His breath echoed back into his face, hot and ragged. Panic surged through him. He clawed at the mask, but his hands were bound. His muffled cries rattled inside the chamber of steel, unheard by anyone who cared. The mask did not simply punish, it erased. It stripped away humanity, voice, identity. To Harrow, Malachi was no longer a boy. He was an example, a warning to the others. This is what happens to those who dare to want, to question, to resist. Hours turned into days. Malachi was forced to work in the fields with the mask still locked to his head. Sweat soaked the inside, dripping into his eyes, stinging until he could barely see. Flies buzzed around the cracks, crawling across his skin. Each breath grew harder as the stench of rust and sweat filled his nostrils. His neck ached from the weight. The world was soundless, airless, merciless, and yet within that prison of iron something else was being forged: anger. Every humiliation seared itself into his memory. The laughter of the overseers as he stumbled and fell. The sight of the slaves, averting their eyes, too terrified to help. The taste of blood on his cracked lips, swallowed with every ragged breath. On the third night, while he lay shackled in the slave quarters, an old woman named Ruth crept near. She had survived 50 years in chains and carried wisdom in her voice. She whispered through the iron so close that her breath brushed his ear. "They put the mask on you to silence you, child. But listen, iron can break, men can bleed, and even the proudest master can fall." Her words seeped into him like water into parched soil. Though Malachi could not reply, his eyes burned with understanding. The mask did not break him, it shaped him. When at last Harrow ordered it removed, Malachi emerged not as a boy crushed, but as a weapon honed. His face bore the raw scars of the steel, but his eyes, once fearful, now glowed with something dangerous. Harrow smirked, satisfied. He thought the punishment had extinguished the spark, but in truth it had ignited the fire. Malachi swore then, in the silence of his heart, that the iron mask would not be his tomb. It would be his symbol. One day he would make Harrow wear the same silence, the same suffocation, the same terror. One day the master would learn what it meant to be erased. For now he waited. He endured. He wore his scars like armor. And in the shadows of the plantation, Malachi began to plan. The fire had been lit, and it would not go out until blood had answered blood. The scars from the iron mask clung to Malachi's face like brands. Thin, angry lines ran across his cheeks and forehead where the metal had pressed into his skin. Each mark was a reminder of his humiliation, but also a vow. Colonel Harrow believed the punishment had done its work. He saw Malachi stumble back into the fields, gaunt and hollow-eyed, and assumed the boy's will had finally broken. To Harrow, pain was not only a deterrent, it was entertainment. "Keep him close," Harrow instructed the overseers. "A beast may forget its chains if the lash doesn't remind it." And so, Malachi was watched more closely than ever. Every move, every glance, every step was measured. Yet beneath that constant scrutiny, his fire only grew hotter. He worked silently, outwardly obedient, but inside his mind was sharpening like a blade. The plantation thrived that summer. Tobacco fields stretched endless under the burning sun, and wagons full of leaves rattled down the road to the markets. But in the shadows of that prosperity lay misery. Enslaved men bent until their backs cracked. Women collapsed from exhaustion. Children were beaten for stumbling too slowly. Harrow walked the rows like a general inspecting soldiers, his eyes seeking weakness, his hand always resting on his cane. For Malachi, each day felt like a test. He could not let his hatred show. He had to learn patience, but patience was the hardest lesson of all. One evening, Harrow gathered a group of slaves to the torture shed. Malachi, forced into the front, felt his stomach twist as the colonel's voice boomed, "Obedience is life. Defiance is death. Let this be known." They dragged forward a man named Isaiah, a tall field hand with strength enough to break any overseer's jaw. He had been caught stealing a cow's leg to feed the starving children in the quarters. For this, Harrow decreed a special punishment. Before the eyes of the others, Isaiah was shackled to the whipping post. The lashes tore across his back, but he did not scream. His silence enraged Harrow, who motioned to the overseers. They brought out the iron mask. Malachi's breath caught. He knew the terror of that mask, the way it stole breath and voice. He could still feel its weight pressing into his bones. Isaiah's head was forced inside. The heavy lock clicked shut. His body trembled, muscles straining, but still he made no sound. "Let him wear it until his spirit breaks," Harrow declared. The others bowed their heads in terror, but Malachi lifted his eyes and met Isaiah's through the narrow slits. In that brief glance he saw not defeat but defiance. Isaiah's silence was not surrender, it was resistance. That night, Isaiah died. They said he suffocated in the mask. The overseers dragged his body away like garbage, leaving only a blood-stained patch of dirt behind. For Malachi, something snapped. His heart pounded with fury as he lay in the quarters, whispering to himself, "This will not go on forever. Someone must strike back." The quarters buzzed with whispers of Isaiah's death. Some prayed, others wept, but all fell silent when Malachi spoke. "Do you see?" His voice was low but fierce. "They think the mask will silence us, but Isaiah showed us the truth. Even in chains he was free. He chose to die rather than bow." The others shushed him in fear. "You'll get yourself killed, boy. Hush before the overseers hear." But Malachi would not hush. For the first time he felt the others' eyes on him, not with pity but with curiosity. That night he crept from the quarters and walked toward the swamp at the edge of the plantation. The air was thick with the croak of frogs and the buzzing of insects. Mud sucked at his bare feet, and in the shadows of the cypress trees he found Ruth, the old woman who had once whispered hope through the mask. She seemed to be waiting. "You've seen enough suffering, child," she said softly. "Now you must decide. Will you die here or will you run?" Malachi's throat tightened. "If I run, they'll hunt me. If I stay, I'll wear the mask again, or worse." Ruth leaned closer. Her eyes glinted like coals in the dark. "Then, there is no choice. You must escape. And when you do, you must carry Isaiah with you. Carry all of us." Malachi clenched his fists. He felt the weight of the scars on his face, the memory of suffocating in the mask, and he remembered Isaiah's final silence, proud even in death. "I'll go," Malachi whispered, "but I'll come back." For Harrow. 2 days later, Malachi's chance came. He was ordered to help unload barrels at the river dock, where wagons carried goods to town. The overseer guarding him grew careless, distracted by a bottle of whiskey. Malachi's eyes flicked to the forest beyond the riverbank. Thick, wild, impenetrable. Freedom lay somewhere in that darkness. His heart thundered. The world slowed. He heard Isaiah's silence, Ruth's words and the laughter of Harrow echoing in his skull. Then he ran. Chains rattled on his ankles, but his legs were swift. The overseer shouted, stumbling after him. A shot rang out, the musket ball whistling past his head. Malachi dove into the trees, the forest swallowing him whole. Branches tore his skin, thorns ripped his clothes, but he kept running, breath burning in his chest, until the sound of pursuit faded into the night. For the first time in his life, he was beyond the reach of Harrow's lash. But freedom was not enough. In the darkness of the forest, Malachi touched the scars on his face. He whispered to himself, voice trembling with rage and promise, "I'll return, Harrow, with the mask you gave me, and I'll make you wear it." The boy who had once been a victim was gone. In his place walked a survivor, scarred, hardened, and hungry for vengeance. The hunt had begun. The swamp became Malachi's cradle of rebirth. Its murky waters, thick with reeds and the cries of unseen creatures, concealed him from the hunting dogs that Colonel Harrow had loosed within hours of his escape. The hounds howled and pawed at the muddy banks, but the swamp swallowed his scent like a grave. For days Malachi moved like a shadow. He drank from streams, ate roots and berries, and wrapped himself in the darkness of the cypress trees. The nights were long, filled with the shrill songs of insects, but they gave him time to think. Each scar on his face throbbed with memory. Each thought returned to the mask. He remembered the cold iron pressing against his skin, the hiss of his own breath trapped inside, the laughter of Harrow as he watched. Those memories became fuel. But mere survival was not enough. If he remained in the swamp forever, Harrow would live on, torturing others, fastening the mask on more faces until silence ruled the quarters. No, freedom was hollow without justice. Malachi's path bent toward vengeance. One evening, as the sun bled red over the treetops, Malachi found a half-collapsed hunting shack. Inside, scattered among broken tools and rotting wood, lay relics left behind. Rusted knives, snares, an old hatchet with a split handle. He tested their weight in his hands, feeling power return to him with each grip. That night, he sharpened the hatchet against stone until it gleamed faintly in the moonlight. His reflection stared back, scarred, gaunt, unrecognizable. No longer the boy beaten into silence. A man carved from pain stood in his place. Malachi began to move closer to the plantation again, circling it like a wolf. He learned the overseer's routines where the guards patrolled, where the weakest points of the fence lay. He watched the torchlight flicker in Harrow's grand house, imagining the man asleep in comfort while others groaned in chains. Each night, his fury grew. He whispered Isaiah's name, his mother's name, the name of every soul he had seen broken by Harrow's hand. The swamp had not only hidden him, it had forged him into a weapon. The night of vengeance came with a storm. Clouds roared above, lightning splitting the sky, rain pelting the earth like musket fire. It was as though the heavens themselves raged with him. Malachi slipped from the woods into the quarters first. His sudden appearance startled the enslaved, who gasped as though seeing a ghost. "Malachi?" one whispered. "We thought you were dead." "I was," Malachi answered, his voice low and steady. "But I've come back for him." They stared, fear and hope warring in their eyes. Some tried to dissuade him. "Don't do it, boy. They'll hang us all." But others, especially the young men who had buried Isaiah, nodded grimly. Malachi did not ask them to fight. He carried his vengeance alone, but as he slipped away he heard one whisper into the storm, "Go and strike for us all." The manor loomed in the lightning, its white columns gleaming like bones. Harrow sat in the dining hall with his brandy, recounting to his overseers the tale of Isaiah's death as if it were a hunting story. Their laughter mingled with the storm outside. Malachi moved silently through the shadows. He entered through the servant's door, his wet clothes clinging to his body, his hatchet gripped tight. Every creak of the floorboards was masked by thunder. He passed the kitchen, remembering years of servitude there, scrubbing floors, serving plates he could never taste. Now he was no servant. Now he was judgment. At last he reached the hall. Colonel Harrow sat with his back turned, a smug silhouette in the firelight. The iron mask, polished and hanging on the wall like a trophy, caught Malachi's eye. Rage surged like fire in his chest. He stepped into the room. "Harrow," he said, his voice cold and unshaking. The overseers turned first, their laughter dying in their throats. Harrow froze, brandy glass halfway to his lips. Slowly, he set it down and turned, his eyes widening at the scarred figure before him. "You," Harrow whispered, "I should have known the swamp wouldn't kill you." Malachi's grip tightened on the hatchet. "You killed my mother. You sold my father. You locked me in that mask. Tonight, you wear it." The overseers lunged. Malachi swung the hatchet in a wide arc, catching the first in the chest. Blood sprayed across the whitewashed walls. The second drew a pistol, but lightning flashed and Malachi slammed the hatchet into his wrist before the shot fired. The gun clattered to the floor. Harrow stumbled backward, reaching for the whip at his belt, but Malachi was upon him, forcing the iron mask from the wall and thrusting it into his chest. "Put it on," Malachi growled. Harrow's eyes bulged with terror. "You wouldn't—" Malachi forced him against the table. The storm outside howled as he clamped the mask over Harrow's face. The colonel screamed, the sound muffled by iron, his hands clawing at the locks. For a moment, Malachi simply watched. The sight was both horror and justice, the tyrant silenced by his own device, but vengeance demanded more. Malachi raised the hatchet one final time. The blade fell. When the storm passed, the Carter plantation blazed. Flames licked at the manor. House, smoke curling into the dawn. The enslaved gathered at a distance, watching in awe as the fire consumed the place of their torment. Some wept, others prayed. A few whispered Malachi's name as though it were holy, but Malachi himself did not appear. Whether he perished in the flames or vanished into the swamp again, none could say. Only one thing was certain. Colonel Harrow's reign of terror was over. The iron mask, once a symbol of submission, had become the tool of justice, and the story of the boy who wore it and returned it spread across the South like wildfire. The dawn after the storm broke across a land changed forever. The Carter plantation, once a place of wealth and cruelty, stood in ruins. Its grand house was nothing more than a blackened shell, smoke curling into the pale morning sky. Ash drifted, on the wind like grey snow. For those who had been enslaved there, the silence was almost unbearable. No whip cracked, no overseer barked orders, no footsteps of Colonel Harrow echoed across the veranda. Only the creak of wood, the hiss of dying embers, and the cries of birds returning to the trees. At first, the people crept forward cautiously, mothers with children on their hips, men with wary eyes, elders leaning on sticks. They circled the ruins as though afraid the house might roar back to life. "Malachi did this," someone whispered. "I saw him last night standing in the storm," another answered. "No, he's dead." He burned in there with Harrow. But even as they debated, one thing was certain. The chains of fear had been broken. The overseers who had survived the night fled into the woods, abandoning their posts. The plantation was leaderless, headless, its master silenced by the same mask he had once used to silence others. Malachi had become a name that carried both dread and hope. To some, he was a ghost, returned from the swamp to claim vengeance. To others, he was flesh and blood, a man who had dared strike back. Either way, he was legend now. In the weeks that followed, the story of the Iron Mask spread far beyond the Carter lands. Traders carried whispers down the river. Field hands repeated it in hushed tones at night. Preachers wove it into sermons. They say the boy wore scars like fire across his face, one voice told. They say he put the mask on the master himself, locked it tight, another added. And when the storm ended, he vanished into the swamp, never to be seen again. The tale shifted as stories do. Some claimed Malachi had grown wings and flown away. Others said he walked north until he found freedom in lands where no chains bound men. Still others believed he lingered in the swamps, a guardian spirit watching over the enslaved. What mattered was not the details, it was the power of the story. For the enslaved, it was proof that even the cruelest master could fall. For the masters, it was a warning whispered in the dark. Cruelty breeds vengeance. The people of the Carter plantation did not remain long. With the fields untended and no master to claim their labor, they scattered. Some sought relatives on nearby estates, others fled north in the cover of night, chasing rumors of freedom across the border lines. Among them, old Aunt Millie, who had once warned Malachi against anger, spoke differently now. Sitting by the ruins with children gathered at her knees, she told his story in solemn tones. Malachi was a boy they tried to break, she said. But fire can't be bent. It burns where it will. Her words planted seeds in young hearts, seeds of courage, seeds of defiance. No one ever truly knew what became of him. Some said his body was never found in the ashes, nor any trace of him in the swamp. Others swore they saw him years later, scarred face hidden beneath a hood, moving silently among the enslaved in distant counties, urging them to rise. A rumor persisted of a masked figure who appeared whenever cruelty reached its height. A shadow that watched overseers with eyes like burning coals. Whether it was Malachi or merely the echo of his legend, none could say. But to those who lived in chains, the thought gave strength. The iron mask itself was never recovered. Some claimed it melted in the fire. Others whispered that Malachi carried it with him into the swamp, keeping it as a reminder of both suffering and survival. Over time, drawings of it began to appear in secret places, scratched into the dirt, behind cabins carved into the wood of hidden meeting houses, etched onto scraps of cloth. The mask became a symbol, not of silence anymore, but of resistance. To wear its image was to whisper, "We will not be broken." Years later, when abolitionists wrote pamphlets and spoke in churches, the story of the Iron Mask surfaced again. It was told as a parable of cruelty, of how desperation turns to rebellion. His name, sometimes spoken, sometimes left unspoken, moved across the land with the wind of change. And when freedom finally came, when chains were cut and the lash, silenced old men and women told children of the boy who would not bow. They told of his scars, his flight through the swamp, his return in the storm, and the fire that consumed his master's house. To those children, Malachi was not just a figure of the past. He was proof that courage could rise from suffering, that even those the world tried to silence could make their voices heard in the loudest way possible. One final story lingered among the elders. They said that on quiet nights, when the swamp is still and the moon rides high, you can hear the faint clank of iron in the dark. Some say it's the ghost of Harrow, still trapped in the mask. Others say it's Malachi himself, carrying the weight of the mask, but never bound by it again. Whatever the truth, the swamp remembers. The land remembers, and the people remember. The Iron Mask became more than an object of torture. It became legend, it became justice, it became hope. And so Malachi's vengeance lived on, not just in fire and fear, but in the hearts of those who survived to tell his story. Because in the end, a mask meant to silence gave birth to a voice that would never be forgotten.